Seamus O'Mahony, welcome to the Real Clear Values podcast.
Thanks very much, Tom. Thanks for inviting me.
Seamus, I absolutely love your book, The Guru, the Bagman and the Sceptic. I'm just going to hold it up for those who are watching this on YouTube. And I believe it was published last year in 2023. Is that correct?
Yes, it came out in February of 2023. So it's out over a year now.
Yeah.
Thank you for the kind words.
Yeah, no, not at all, and it's entirely genuine. I remember I'm very much a nerd in relation to books, so much so that when I do buy a book in physical copy and from a shop, I always retain the receipt. So I can tell that I actually bought the book not long after it came out. I think it was in March 2023 in Waterstones in Leeds, and it captured my attention. I was at one of those junctures in life where I didn't want to buy any more books, but it just stood out to me. I thought this is a really fascinating story, and I would say, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong or if you see it differently, but I see it as something of a biographical or a comparative biography between two very interesting figures. And your background, as I understand it, is very much based in the sort of the biomedical science, if you like, whereas this is moving across from that, it's moving away from that to some extent. Obviously, one of the characters is very much based in biomedical science. But the cut and thrust of the book is about psychoanalysis. So it's moving away, well, it's moving towards psychology and then making some comparisons with a key figure in the book who deals in the other realm as well. So first of all, first things first, Seamus, obviously your background is very much in biomedical science. So why did you decide to take this direction with this book? Because you've written other books as well that have been very well received and received acclaim in your specific sphere, but this is a little bit of a shift for you. So why the shift?
Well, my background is in hospital medicine, and I worked as a gastroenterologist for many years. I trained and worked in Leeds for nearly a decade, so I was a frequent visitor to Waterstones in Leeds. So gastroenterology, for those who are not familiar with it, is that branch of hospital medicine that deals with diseases of the stomach, intestine, and liver. And I worked in that capacity both in the UK and Ireland for many years. I stepped down or gave up the work just before COVID arrived in February 2020. Now, you've mentioned my previous books. The first one was about death and dying. So I suppose it was based on my hospital experience, but it was for the general reader, and it wasn't specifically about biomedicine. It was about medicine and society's unhealthy relationship with our mortality. I then wrote a book called Can Medicine Be Cured?, which is a critique of where I felt modern medicine had gone astray. Shortly into lockdown, I wrote a book about my last year as a practicing doctor called The Ministry of Bodies, which was looking back over my career, what I had learned or what I hadn't learned. But yes, this new book is a departure in that it's a historical work primarily. It is a joint biography of three people. Freud, obviously, his biographer, Ernest Jones, and Jones's brother-in-law and closest friend, an English surgeon called Wilfred Trotter. So Freud obviously is, one of the most famous doctors who ever lived, possibly the most famous. People who know nothing about medicine or psychology or psychiatry have heard of Sigmund Freud. Ernest Jones, his biographer, is very well known within psychology and psychiatry and psychoanalysis. But if you ask, people not connected with this world, have they heard of Ernest Jones? And 99% of people would say no. But he was very influential in the development of psychoanalysis, and he was Freud's most loyal and closest disciple. He played a key role in the development of psychoanalysis. Now, I had written in passing about Wilfred Trotter some years ago when I was writing about the phenomenon of doctors as polymaths. And he was one of the few real polymaths I felt had been produced by the medical profession. So not only was he a brilliant surgeon, but he'd written this famous book about social psychology called Instincts of the Herd. He was also a very accomplished experimental scientist. He was a witty aphorist and essayist. And I had written also about Freud nearly a decade ago now. I wrote a fairly long review of a biography of Freud for the Dublin Review of Books, an online literary magazine to which I've contributed for quite some time. So I had always been interested in psychoanalysis and Freud, not from the medical point of view, but as a cultural and social phenomenon. I was intrigued by how psychoanalysis achieved this global dominance. And I was always intrigued by the persona of Freud as an intellectual and as a thinker. And when I found the connection that Trotter had with Jones, that they were brothers-in-law, that when they were young men, they had this intensely close friendship. In fact, they lived together. Trotter was somewhat older. And then Trotter later married Jones's sister. And I thought, here's a connection that could provide the framework for a book that I had been wanting to write about psychoanalysis. And I suppose in this book, Jones is really the key figure because he is the connection. It's his story which provides the spine of the book. Freud drifts in and out, as does Trotter. And Trotter really represents everything that I feel is good and should be good about medicine, everything that we should aspire as doctors to be. And Trotter, I suppose, is there almost as an avatar of my own views. Trotter was opposed essentially to psychoanalysis, although he admired Freud very much. He was not persuaded by psychoanalysis in the way that Ernest Jones was. And there's a key event early on in the story and in the book, which is in 1908. The very first International Psychoanalytic Congress was held in Salzburg, and only about 50 people went to it. The meeting was organized by Jung, Carl Gustav Jung, and amongst the 50 people who went to the meeting were Jones and Trotter. And Freud was the star of the meeting, of course, and the meeting was even called the Congress of Freudian Psychologies. I'm translating from the German. And Freud famously gave the keynote lecture at this Congress. He was allocated 1 hour, but spoke for 5. Jones was absolutely entranced by Freud. This meeting was for him, his road to Damascus. He decided there and then, this is the cause to which I'm going to devote the rest of my life. This is the master who I am going to follow. Trotter, on the other hand, thought this was largely nonsense and returned to London. So it was a parting of the ways for these two young men who had been incredibly close. And even though they remained connected because of the marriage to Jones's sister, they drifted apart as the great friendship withered. They no longer shared ideas. They no longer had these intense intellectual discussions. So Jones emigrated to Canada, eventually came back to London, set up in psychoanalytic practice. and essentially became the key figure in the development of psychoanalysis, certainly in Britain, but also in the English-speaking world. Became Freud's biographer in the 1950s. He was the keeper of the flame. He was the head disciple. Trotter, meanwhile, became this great surgeon, and as I've mentioned, also writer, intellectual, scientist. Their paths crossed again when Freud was dying. Trotter was one of the doctors called in to see him when Freud was dying in London in 1939. And in fact, Freud and Trotter died within a couple of months of each other. So their stories end around the same time in 1939. So that's the background to the book and the three figures. And I thought that this triple biography approach, I think, is a good scaffolding to tell the story of psychoanalysis, but also of medicine during this time. And it's also, I think, a meditation on the nature of fame, and how sometimes fame is undeserved, very often undeserved. So Trotter, for example, was, after his death, almost completely forgotten, even though he was the great figure in British surgery in the years between the war. Famously saved the life of King George V when he was dying of a lung abscess in 1929, wrote this best-selling book, but, you know, within a year or two of his death, almost forgotten. Whereas Freud now has this level of iconic fame. So people who have never read a word of what he wrote could recognize a picture immediately of Freud with the cigar and the gaze and so on. So it's about the nature of fame as well. So I wanted to make a book that the general reader who isn't particularly interested in psychoanalysis or is not part of that community could read and enjoy and be entertained by, but could learn a lot about the history of it as well. So that's what I was trying to do, but also to make it plausible from a scholarly and intellectual point of view as well. So those were my ambitions in writing the book.
Yeah, that's very interesting, especially looking at it from a medical point of view. And I do love the way that you've intertwined the different characters, because I'd certainly never heard of Trotter, and I don't believe I'd heard of Jones beforehand either. But the subtitle, which I should have read out as well, is A Story of Science, Sex and Psychoanalysis. So that spices it up a little bit. And it is, dare I say, quite a salacious tale. And that's not to say that you've emphasized that yourself. You're literally telling the story of the birth of psychoanalysis. And it does sound like there is this sort of salacious element to it, where people are kind of getting together, exploring all these weird and wonderful ideas in relation to sex and sexual exploration. Some of the characters that you mentioned, people like Otto Gross, are seen as the leading lights of the sexual revolution. Is so how do you what do you make of all that? What do you make of the role of people's personal sexual
Yeah.
desires and fantasies in relation to the birth of psychoanalysis?
Yeah. Freud, of course, stressed the importance of sexual conflict, which was largely operating at an unconscious level, and stressed the importance of infantile sexuality. So he claimed that people had sexual urges long before puberty, and brought into this the Oedipus complex and ideas like penis envy and so on. And now, but despite all of this emphasis on the sexual origin of neurosis, Freud himself was a very conventional person in terms of his own life and marriage and sexual behavior. He was a deeply conservative bourgeois Viennese who was very uxorious, he was completely faithful to his wife, although some have claimed that there was some relationship with his sister-in-law, which I personally don't believe. But he was very conventional and conservative himself. Now, his followers, many of them, as you've alluded to, were not, principally Ernest Jones himself. Now, Jones is an extraordinary figure in that if you look at the photographs of him, you don't look at them and say, oh, gosh, there's Brad Pitt or Cillian Murphy. So he was a rather small, unprepossessing chap, but he seemed to have this intense sexual magnetism. And he attracted all sorts of women, including several of his patients, who many of whom wrote these extraordinarily explicit letters to him. And these include women like Ethel Vaughan Sawyer, who was a famous suffragette and surgeon, which how many female surgeons were around in those days? Joan Revere, who effectively stalked him, and Edith Eder, who was the wife of another psychoanalyst, Otto Gross's wife. So he had relations with some of these women. There is sexual relations. There is absolutely no doubt. He had to leave London and quit medicine in London because of accusations of sexual impropriety. He had hoped for a career as a neurologist in one of the London teaching hospitals, but these hopes were dashed. He was formally tried for indecent behavior in 1906 when he was working as a medical inspector of schools in London and was accused of indecent behavior with children. He was acquitted on the grounds that the judge would not accept the evidence of children with an intellectual disability. 2 years later, he was the subject of a similar accusation in another hospital and was simply asked to leave that employment. So Jones, as a young man, was very sexually active, was the subject of several accusations of sexual misconduct, and was involved with several women, some of whom were patients. So he had this intense sexual magnetism, which doesn't come across in the photographs. And he wasn't the only one of Freud's followers who had very unconventional private lives. You've mentioned Otto Gross, who was an early Austrian follower of Freud. Otto Gross was one of the forerunners in the sexual revolution. He was a rather bizarre character whose main problem really was drug addiction. But he practiced a form of psychoanalysis in a cafe in Munich, spent most of the proceeds on morphine and cocaine, ended up in an asylum under the care of Carl Gustav Jung, and eventually died homeless and penniless in a street in Berlin in 1920. He preached a doctrine of free love, and as I say, was a forerunner of the sexual revolution in the 1960s. And then there
Just on,
were,
sorry,
yeah,
sorry, Seamus, just on Otto Gross. There's something that's really interesting about Gross, because I remember reading in the book
yeah,
he had, and I'm sure it was Gross. I'm sure I'm getting this right, but Gross had this phrase, didn't he? Repress nothing. That was
repress nothing.
that
Yeah,
was his catchphrase, wasn't it? Repress nothing. And
yes,
this licentiousness that he had, but also this sort of hedonism, this sort of uncontrollable hedonistic urge that he had, really
yeah.
led him, like you say, led him to drugs. He was a drug addict, and he came to a bitter end, and he had all of these dalliances and everything else. But his motto was repress nothing. And are we seeing a little bit of that in society now? Do you think, with this idea that repressing stuff and self-control isn't cool, and that you should just do, a phrase that's popular these days is "you do you." This idea that you just do whatever you feel like whenever you feel like. Do you see any echoes of that today?
Yes, certainly. We now live in a world where we are strongly encouraged to um, share our feelings, and it is regarded as not only permissible but in fact healthy to do so. And um, we have examples of oversharing, people like Prince Harry, and one half of the world, which would be my half, thinks this is absurd, and the other half thinks, my children's generation, oh well, good on you. This is okay, fine. Share it all. It's all good. Um, and of course, this has been facilitated by social media in particular, and technology. But yes, you're right. There is there is a consensus that to repress things is bad, and that repression only leads to um, forms of neurosis and mental distress and so on, and that if you repress things, that you're essentially causing damage to yourself, and that it is healthy and cathartic for you to share all of these feelings, no matter what these feelings are. So you can say for sure that the notion in England of the stiff upper lip from the royal family down to the lowest commoner has certainly evaporated over this generation, that's for sure.
Yeah, yeah, that's a very interesting point, and that well, I suppose there is a direct parallel, isn't there? You mentioned Prince Harry and his tell-all biography, and then you mentioned also the erosion of the stiff upper lip, and we're in a different time and space now. But I find it interesting because you don't want to over extrapolate from individual examples. But what is interesting is that the person who coins the phrase "repress nothing" and is held up as an icon of the sexual revolution did not come to a good ending. And I think people forget those sorts of things. That those details are kind of inconvenient. The outcomes of the people who actually set these things up is sort of divorced from the romanticism of and the appeal of just doing whatever you want whenever you want. Because and there's an irony in that, isn't there? I mean, in psychoanalysis, you talk a lot about you certainly talk about the child ego state and the adult ego state, and what's more childish than doing whatever you want whenever you want and not having any self-control? So I think there are some real ironies, but I also think that Gross isn't the only one in this, and this is what really interested me in the book, is that there is this kind of it's certainly not a golden thread by any means, but there is certainly like this sexual thread that runs through the entire book of these weird and wonderful characters who, some of them even get into sorry, not genetic, genital mutilation, and
Yeah,
and
yeah,
believe that that's to do with their psyche and them being in a
yeah,
better state as a result of mutilating their own genitalia. It's really
yeah,
bizarre
yeah.
stuff.
That is you're alluding to Princess Mary Bonaparte,
Yes.
and um, she was one of the many high-profile followers of Freud in the 1920s and 30s. She came to Freud in the 20s for analysis. She was the great grandniece of the Emperor Napoleon, and her grandfather was a billionaire who'd founded the Casino of Monte Carlo. So she was not only royal, but she was, extraordinarily wealthy. And Freud attracted a lot of these very high-profile people. But I mean, her case is extraordinary in that she developed this theory of female sexuality, which was absolutely bonkers and bizarre. And her theory was that one form of what she called frigidity in women was anatomical, and that it was due to an excessive difference between the clitoris and vaginal orifice, and that if you shortened this distance surgically, then this would cure the frigidity. So she managed to convince an Austrian gynecologist called Halban that this was a plausible theory, and she worked with him on corpses that they'd somehow got from the morgue in Vienna doing this operation. Now, Halban only ended up doing the operation 5 times. He performed the procedure 3 times on print. Incredibly powerful, wealthy person auto-mutilating with the cooperation of a professor of gynecology to pursue some madcap idea about female sexuality. And but this was sort of not unusual at the time. And she, became one of the great figures of psychoanalysis subsequently in France. And worked as a psychoanalyst herself. There were many other bizarre characters attracted to psychoanalysis, not least people from Bloomsbury and from Cambridge. So I cited the cases of James Strachey and his wife Alex, and also Adrian and Karen Stephen. Adrian Stephen was Virginia Woolf's brother. And these were 2 sort of people from the Bloomsbury Circle. So the Bloomsbury Circle was a sort of loose community of artists and intellectuals around the famous people like Virginia Woolf and John Maynard Keynes and Lytton Strachey. And so James Strachey, who was Lytton's brother, was a sort of underachieving member of this community, as was Adrian Stephen. So both of these were looking up to these, high-achieving, fabulously famous siblings. And they eventually found a cause and a home for themselves and a purpose in psychoanalysis. And similarly, Cambridge intellectuals, many of whom were also Bloomsbury figures, many of these people went out to Vienna in the 1920s to undergo analysis, not because they were suffering from any psychological or psychiatric disease or anxiety or neurosis, but because they thought that analysis was something that clever intellectuals should undergo as a form of neurological fine-tuning. And so psychoanalysis was as powerfully influential in Cambridge in the 1920s as communism was in the 1930s. And you had this flood of people from Cambridge going out to Vienna in the early 1920s to be analyzed. Now, they were able to do this because after the First World War, the Austrian currency collapsed and the value of the pound in terms of purchasing power was huge. So these Cambridge intellectuals could live for virtually nothing while they were undergoing, analysis. So I'm talking about people like Frank Ramsey, who died tragically young, but made huge contributions during his short life to logic, philosophy, economics, probability theory, and so on. Lionel Penrose, Sebastian Sprott. There's a whole generation of them went out, and of course they formed a secret society when they all got back to Cambridge of people who had undergone analysis.
Yeah, yeah. So just on that point, Seamus, you mentioned that some of these leading lights, if you like, in the field of psychoanalysis, had these madcap ideas. Why was it that all these intelligent people were attracted to these crazy ideas? Why weren't these ideas just thrown out, dismissed out of hand as crazy ideas? Why did they get traction? And more specifically, why did they get traction amongst wealthy intellectual circles?
Well, the first and rather prosaic reason is that wealthy intellectuals found that they liked nothing more than talking about themselves at great length. And psychoanalysis appealed to them greatly for this reason, and still appeals to wealthy intellectuals. So psychoanalysis, its heyday has long passed, but it survives in London and New York and Paris because it still appeals to wealthy intellectuals. And what I would call, or somebody else has called, a great American historian called Christopher Lasch, called the hydra-headed narcissism of the urban bourgeoisie. That's the first reason. I think the second reason was that in the wake of the First World War, there was this vacuum, this intellectual vacuum. And religion and philosophy just didn't seem to fill this vacuum in the wake of the carnage and the horror of the Great War. And along came this theory, which was all-encompassing. This wasn't just a way of treating neurosis. This, as far as these Cambridge intellectuals were concerned, this was a theory that explained not only the normal human mind and neurosis, but it explained economics, religion, philosophy, history, anthropology. It explained everything. And it was an all-embracing universal theory of everything that seemed to attract and seemed to fill this vacuum in the post-First World War years. So the success of psychoanalysis was partly down to timing.
Yeah.
Now, Freud had written the great books, in the 10 years between about 1895 and 1905, but psychoanalysis really only gained international traction in the years after the Great War. That's when it became this global phenomenon. And I believe that it was because of this particular timing. This vacuum emerged in this period, and psychoanalysis seemed to partly fill this vacuum.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's so interesting to me. This is one of the reasons why your book was so interesting, is because it very much reminds me of reading Nietzsche, reading Jung as well, and talking about the death of God. What Nietzsche referred to as the death of God, which he was writing about in the late more towards the late 19th century, and he was writing about the death of God and about how there was this existential vacuum. And there are going to be consequences to this. We now have these sort of borderless horizons, as he put it, when he wrote the parable of the madman. And then Jung took what Nietzsche said, disagreed with Nietzsche in a lot of ways, respected Nietzsche immensely also. And he talked about, and obviously he was a mentee of Freud. He was Freud's star pupil to a point, but he realized that Freud had replaced God with sex. So he almost deified sex, whereas Nietzsche had deified power. And so I think you're absolutely right in terms of the timing of this, that people were at this point where they were thinking, well, what next? People have, put us, in intellectual circles, people have put aside the idea of God and religion seems like old hat. So what is it going to be now? What is going to give us our answers? And I think about Jung as well in particular. I mean, Jung was very much aware of the rise or the potential rise of demagogues, for example. And in one of his later books, he had this phrase which has always stuck with me, which says, "You can take away a man's gods, but only to replace them with other gods." And I think about people like Freud as being almost, like you say, deified in some respects, because, they've got these people, you use the word disciple to refer to Jones. And Jones very much was a disciple. He very much was somebody who promoted Freud. And in fact, one point that you make in the book, which I think is really interesting, is how the neo-Freudians look down and they're a bit snooty towards Jones, but they have to admit that, Freud's work needed somebody, it needed a hype man or a promoter like Jones to get off the ground, because without him, does anybody ever hear of it? Does it get off the ground without these sort of protagonists?
No, no, and indeed, Jones often compared himself to T.H. Huxley, who promoted the ideas of Darwin. And Jones said, we were both bonny fighters. So Huxley was called Darwin's bulldog, and, Jones was Freud's bulldog. So Darwin was I guess, the most influential thinker leading up to Freud. And Darwin's ideas, were incredibly influential and remain so. They took man away from the center of the world and the universe. Man became just the most highly evolved animal, really. Not a creature made in any divine image. And Freud's theories build on that to a certain extent, in that this creature is motivated by these subconscious instincts of sex and aggression and so on, which are, often sublimated and subconscious, but are there and are driving human behavior. So Darwinism leads, logically onto Freudianism, intellectually and historically. And as you say, Jones was necessary for the propagation of these ideas, certainly within the English-speaking world, where Freudianism became certainly most powerful. I mean, ironically, Freud did not like the United States, but that is the country and the society where his ideas took the root, really, more than any other country. It certainly never flourished in Britain in the way that it did in the US. In the years after the Second World War, most university departments of psychiatry were headed by Freudians. That's all evaporated now. But in those decades after the Second World War, right up to the 1960s, Freudianism was the dominant force within mainstream academic psychiatry. That has all evaporated and it's all gone. But Jones is interesting in that it was his biography, as much as anything, in the 1950s that helped to disseminate Freudian ideas to the lay public. His biography of Freud, which is very unlike most other psychoanalytic writings, it's very readable, and I strongly recommend it. It's very, very well written. Jones was actually a very good writer. Most psychoanalytic writings are impenetrable, jargonistic, almost unreadable, but Jones's biography is excellent. It's really good, and that helped a great deal. And Jones, of course, was a brilliant politician. He founded psychoanalytic societies. He ran the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, and he was brilliant at maintaining orthodoxy. I mean, he was like a sort of secret police for Freud. If anybody was stepping out of line, Jones was immediately on to the boss, and he was briefing against Jung from a very early stage. Now, Jung and Freud split very early on. It would be 1912, 1913, pre-war. But as early as 1909, Jones was briefing Freud, about Jung. So, he was a combination of biographer, chief disciple, secret police,
Chief Whip.
Chief Whip, yeah. He kept everybody in line.
Yeah.
All of these movements need these kind of behind the scenes people, rather like Francis Urquhart in that great television program, the it'll come to me, but anyway, yeah. So Jones was the prime political mover of the movement.
Yeah, and it relied on charisma, didn't it? It relied on Freud being a celebrity, kind of like this Wizard of Oz sort of figure, the guru, as you put it. It relied on him being this sort of intellectual figure who is impervious to any sort of criticism or any sort of deeper digging. Because, like you say, he had an answer for everything. I mean, he wrote a book on Moses, didn't he? To Moses and monotheism towards the end of his life. So he was into absolutely everything with all these answers and these speculations about this and that, and believing that Moses was killed in the desert by one of his followers or something like that. Where where's he got the information for that from? All these sort of spurious ideas that he put forward. But because it was Freud, it was seen as credible because he built his credibility through his celebrity, didn't he?
Well, he started off as the leader of a sort of small group of people in Vienna, and he had this personal charisma. He had a great intellect, and he was a very good writer. He was also actually, I believe, a person of integrity, and that attracted people who did not always share this integrity, as I've alluded to. So psychoanalysis started out really as a small group of people who had gathered around him in Vienna, and all of them were Jewish. Every single one of the original group who met on Wednesday evenings in his apartment in the Berggasse were all Jewish doctors, all male. And he had many of the characteristics of the guru and other gurus. So he, first of all, had this personal charisma that attracted people to him. Second, he had this absolute conviction about his ideas. So in this sense, he was a sort of anti-scientist, because real scientists are full of doubt, hesitancy, reticence. But he had absolute certainty and conviction about his ideas and theories. And this attracts people. This attracts followers. They want certainty. They want answers. He also made huge generalizations from his own life. So because he had kind of strange feelings towards his father as a boy, he decided that these feelings were universal, and therefore coined the Oedipus complex.
Yeah. Is that not the ultimate projection, ironically?
Yeah, ironically, the ultimate projection. So he extrapolated events from his own life and claimed that these were universal phenomena. And far from being dismissed, this made his message even more powerful, because he delivered his message with such absolutism and such conviction. And he also had the classic sort of guru experience of the dark night of the soul. So when he was in his 30s, he had a prolonged sort of spiritual crisis, which was kind of a period of depression, possibly triggered by the death of his father, a period of deep uncertainty about where his life was going. And he delved deep into his soul, and he called this self-analysis, of course. And it was like the equivalent of Jesus's 40 days in the desert. And from this period in his life, Freud emerged with these ideas about the subconscious, about the Oedipus complex, and so on. And again, this is classic, guru behavior. And I think the tragedy of psychoanalysis and the paradox of it is that Freud, as a young man, had trained as a scientist. He had worked initially in zoology and then in neuroanatomy and neurophysiology, and would happily have stayed as a neuroscientist were it not for the fact that he was Jewish and that he wanted to get married. He was told by his academic superior, Brucker, who was a great neuroanatomist and neurophysiologist, that as a Jew, he would never achieve academic promotion at the University of Vienna. And Brucker advised him, you're going to have to go and practice clinical medicine and make your living that way, because you're never going to get on, even though you're clever and able, you're never going to get on in this academic milieu because you're Jewish. And Freud was desperate to get married to his fiancée, Martha Bernays. So it was these anti-Semitism and because he wanted to get married, that forced him out of academic life, where he had been, to all intents and purposes, a neuroscientist. And then when he first started writing about psychoanalysis in his late 30s, he abandoned all pretense of scientific method.
Yeah.
And he did not have scientific instincts, such as the first instinct of a scientist is, I could be wrong. Let's look at the data. Is this right? Am I extrapolating? Am I making, drawing too deep a conclusion from too small a data set? Let's go back and look again. Scientists are full of doubt and reticence, but he abandoned the instincts of a scientist.
Yeah.
When he became when he developed psychoanalysis, yet to the day that he died, he insisted on calling it a science.
Yes.
And this is part of the theme of the book again, and why I've put science in the subtitle, because this was a great tragedy and paradox of psychoanalysis.
Yeah,
that
yeah.
it kept calling it a science.
Yeah, you do make that point really well in the book, actually, that Freud was more philosopher than scientist, which is fine. But like you say, Freud's very much talking as though he's a scientist, when in actual fact he's a philosopher. These are ideas. I mean, again, going back to Jung, when I read some of Jung's work on the collective unconscious and things along those lines, he's very clear at the outset that it isn't a scientific piece, that it is from his experiences and from various different conversations that he had with people, and he's very clear at the outset what this is and what this isn't. Whereas it sounds like Freud is something else. But you mentioned the name Bernays. There's another Bernays in the book, Edward Bernays, who was instrumental in the creation of Freud's personality cult, and he also influenced Joseph Goebbels, did he not?
Yeah. So just to put this guy in context, Edward Bernays was Freud's double nephew. His father was Freud's wife's brother, and his mother was Freud's sister. So he was a double nephew of Sigmund Freud. And his family emigrated to America when Edward Bernays was a small child. So he grew up in America. He lived to a great age. He was 103 or something when he died. And he is regarded as the father of public relations, essentially, as a profession in America. He effectively invented it. And while he looked up to his uncle Sigmund with great admiration, I have argued in the book that, in fact, it was Wilfred Trotter who influenced him more than Freud. So Trotter wrote a famous book about social psychology in 1916, right in the middle of the First World War, called Instincts of the Herd in Peace and War. And in this book, Trotter argued that we are essentially social animals, and that what defines us more than anything else is gregariousness, and that we are very much driven by conformity and by herd behavior. And this was pretty much in direct opposition to Freud, who argued that no, what influences us most and what determines our behavior are these subconscious conflicts that I've mentioned earlier. Anyway, Bernays was very taken with Trotter's book, and he realized that people, not individually, but as large groups, were incredibly malleable by propaganda and by advertising. And he famously worked on behalf of the American tobacco industry in the 1920s. They came to him asking him, how do you think we could promote smoking amongst women? Because at the time, smoking amongst women was socially stigmatized, particularly outdoor smoking. So a lot of women smoked, but they only did so in the confines of their own home, and they never did so in public, and certainly not outdoors. And Bernays came up with this brilliant idea. He linked smoking with female emancipation. And he came up with this brilliant phrase calling cigarettes torches of freedom. So he paid a whole bunch of women to pose as suffragettes and to march up and down New York's, I think, Fifth Avenue on an Easter Sunday in the 1920s. He got photographers out from the New York Times who splashed this all over the front page saying, "Women march with their torches of freedom." So there was this photograph of allegedly suffragette feminist ladies walking along, proudly smoking their torches of freedom. In private, of course, Bernays was militantly anti-smoking, flushed his wife's cigarettes down the toilet, but was happy to take the dollar from the tobacco industry. But he wrote in a book that he wrote called Crystallizing Public Opinion many years later, and he described this episode. But he credited Trotter with influencing his conception of human behavior in large groups and how that could be influenced.
Yeah.
So he certainly was influenced by Freud, and in fact tried to act as Freud's agent to a certain extent. When Freud became famous, nothing came of it. He tried to get Freud to write articles for Cosmopolitan for huge fees and to come and lecture in America and so on. Freud didn't want to do it. In fact, Freud had a deep aversion to America and as a culture, which was ironic because that was the country where his ideas took the deepest hold. But Bernays was really more influenced by Trotter's social psychology than his uncle's individual psychology.
And that is very ironic, because you think, like you said at the start of the call, everybody knows who Freud is. Everybody knows the name Freud. Everybody knows what Freud is associated with, but nobody knows Trotter. Nobody knows Trotter. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, in the book you quote a letter that you got from some of the archives or one of the institutions that you contacted that Trotter had been affiliated with, and they didn't have any record of him even. So he's a forgotten man. Was it one of the universities, was it?
UCH, University College Hospital, London, where Trotter had been, he spent most of his career both as student and practicing surgeon. And, if you read accounts of the time, people who had trained at UCH, and they looked up to him almost as a godlike figure. And he's not entirely forgotten now, in fairness, in that there was the annual prize for surgery in the final medical exam was the Wilfred Trotter Prize, and that was awarded up until a couple of years ago when the money ran out. But I did write to the archive people in UCH, and nothing. In fact, they didn't even know who he was. Now, in fairness, I did contact one of the professors of surgery in UCH, who knew all about Trotter and was and is a great admirer of his. But when I contacted the library at UCH and for any archival material, there was nothing. So not only is he unknown in the world outside, the broader society, he's forgotten in the institution where he once held this godlike status. So I think it's an interesting meditation on the transience of fame.
Yeah.
But Trotter, I'm hoping to resurrect at least his reputation within medicine. I may not make him famous outside of medicine, but I regard Trotter as an exemplar of everything that is good in medicine and that we as doctors should aspire to be.
And what is that then? Because you make some really powerful points in the book about this. So let's dig into that a little bit.
Okay, so Trotter was a consultant surgeon and later professor of surgery at one of the great London teaching hospitals in the 1930s when he reached that. And this was in a period when, surgeons by and large conformed to the stereotype portrayed by James Robertson Justice, who played Sir Lancelot Spratt in these Doctor in the House movies. You're way too young to remember these movies. These movies are huge. These movies are huge in the 50s and 60s. And essentially, this Sir Lancelot Spratt figure was a London teaching hospital surgeon, and he was arrogant, rude, treated like a god, held absolute power in the hospital. How things have changed, said he. But anyway, consultant surgeons in those days were arrogant, remote figures. They didn't view empathy or compassion as very important parts of their work. But Trotter did not conform to this stereotype. He had this genius, and I use that word advisedly and deliberately. He had this genius for listening to people, be they a duchess or a slum landlady. He would listen at great length to the longest, most rambling story with infinite patience and attention. Not only that, but he had this personal humility that encouraged people to talk to him. He was kind and courteous to all of his patients, to the junior staff, to the students, to the nurses. Social rank and status mattered nothing to him. He was a brilliant technical surgeon, by common consent, the greatest surgeon of the era. Brilliant. But he achieved this without becoming arrogant or insufferable. He wasn't a bit snobbish about surgery as a craft. And he argued consistently that medicine is not an applied science, that there was a great deal of snobbery about medicine being an applied science. He said, no, it's not. We're artisans. We practice a practical craft similar to a builder or a farmer. And he argued, yes, we do need to go to science, but most of the time, what we do is a craft. It's not applying science, and we should get over ourselves. Now, this is from a man who became a fellow of the Royal Society, the highest award, short of a Nobel Prize, that science can bestow on a person. And it was the only award that he ever accepted, was the Fellowship of the Royal Society. And he won this for this incredibly difficult and brilliant experiment that he had performed on himself, cutting nerves, seven different cutaneous nerves in his own body. He did this with another surgeon called Morriston Davis. And they published this famous paper on nerve regeneration, which contradicted and indeed blew out of the water a previous work by two famous neurologists called W.H.R. Rivers and Henry Head. Work which, by the way, inspired Pat Barker's novel Regeneration. But anyway, so Trotter was this combination of surgeon, writer, teacher, practical craftsman. And, you know, the story of how he saved the life of George V tells you a great deal about royalty, about medicine. And I just like to kind of mention it here because it tells you so much. So George V in 1928, in the winter of 1928, got a pneumonia complicated by an abscess on his lung, an empyema. And his care was coordinated by the famous Lord Dawson of Penn, the most eminent physician in the country. And Penn called in more than a dozen of the most eminent doctors in the country. And they eventually carried out an operation to drain this abscess. But this operation really didn't work because the surgeon who performed it, Sir Hugh Rigby, hadn't been radical enough in his drainage of this abscess. Anyway, this abscess, this infection lingered on with pus draining out of the king's side and so on, until finally, you know, more than 6 months into this illness, Trotter was called in by Dawson and Rigby. Trotter was called by Buckingham Palace and said, you know, we'll send a car, collect you and bring you to the palace. And, you know, Trotter, big Trotter, humble, unshowy, said, oh, don't worry, I'll get the number 14 bus. I was going to call this book, by the way, The Man on the Number 14 Bus. So he goes to Buckingham Palace, he operates on the king, does a proper drainage of the abscess. King is cured. All of the other surgeons and physicians involved were given baronetcies and knighthoods, and Trotter said no, and presumably got the bus out of the back entrance to Buckingham Palace. So the story kind of summarizes for me, first of all, his technical brilliance, but second of all, his unshowiness, his humility, his lack of arrogance and self-regard. And one of the books I read in preparation, in research, part of the research for this book, was his collected essays, which were published in 1942 by his son, 3 years after his death. And I could hand out those essays now to trainee doctors and medical students and say, read that. This will tell you what you really need to know about the profession that you're now embarking on. Read it. So this is 80 years on. This will tell you the core of what is important in our profession and what you need to know.
Yeah.
So for me, he stands not only as representing science, but representing what we should aim to be as doctors.
Yeah.
So he stands as the polar opposite to Freud in many ways. Freud, by the way, always was happy to admit that he never wanted to be a doctor. He had very ambivalent feelings about seeing people. He only went into medical practice, as I've said, because of reasons of anti-Semitism and the need to earn a living. He would happily have stayed working in a laboratory in the University of Vienna. He didn't like clinical practice. He didn't like people particularly. He freely admitted that he thought the mass of humanity were worthless. He admitted that he could not have practiced as a psychiatrist because he knew nothing about the management of serious psychiatric disease like psychosis and melancholia. He famously, failed to spot a patient having a manic episode, a bipolar patient. He didn't recognize what was going on. He just said, this person is behaving like a mad hen, was about the only label he could put on it. He didn't know, he couldn't have functioned even as a psychiatrist, and yet he's the most famous psychiatrist who ever lived. He said that he admitted he wasn't a great analyst because he got bored with people and was impatient. So Freud freely admitted all of these things and was very ambivalent about his lack of vocation as a doctor. He really didn't have a vocation for medicine.
Yeah.
He would have been perfectly happy as an intellectual. And I'm not quite sure how he ended up really in medical school. I guess, he was the bright son of a Jewish family, not too wealthy Jewish family, so hardly surprising that he would do that. I think he would have been happiest as a historian or philosopher. I think he would have been happier in the humanities, although he did enjoy his time doing academic neuroscience. So he's the polar opposite to Trotter.
Yeah, yeah.
And so Trotter is there in the book as almost the anti-Freud.
Yeah.
And Trotter stands for what is the scientific method about and the limits of science as well. Although Trotter wrote this famous paper and became a fellow of the Royal Society, he was always quick to tell his students, let's not get too excited about the latest developments in science. Let's not overstate it. Let's remember, we're artisans. We're not scientists.
Yeah.
And this is one of the delusions of medicine to this day: is that we're applied scientists. No, we're not.
Yeah. I've had these sort of conversations many times with medical practitioners where they haven't been able to find answers to things, and then other modalities have been able to find answers to things, but those things have been poo-pooed because they're not within the priesthood of the biomedical health model. And that, in a way, that kind of relates to a point that you make in the book about the power of care. And there's a really powerful example that you share from, is it from World War II or World War One? World War II. So when I think it's a Soviet soldier who's dropped off by the Nazis, and he's screaming the place down because he's got pleurisy. And you take over from me because you'll be able to tell this story better than I will. And it's really powerful.
It's from the memoir of a great figure and doctor called Archie Cochrane. The name Cochrane is known to everybody now within medicine because one of the pillars of evidence-based medicine, which everybody, even outside of medicine, I think has heard of now, is what's known as the Cochrane Collaboration, which is an international organization which gathers together the best evidence available for all sorts of medical interventions and treatments. And it's named in honor of Archie Cochrane, who was a great epidemiologist. Cochrane comes into the story because part of the reason why he became the father of evidence-based medicine, the founder of it, was that he underwent prolonged analysis himself as a young man for a sexual problem. And after this prolonged analysis, he came to the conclusion that A, it had failed him, and B, that there was no evidence that analysis was of any use. And this prompted his whole career then in looking at everything in medicine, every treatment, and say, okay, where's the evidence? Well, he was a student on the wards. He also went to UCH. When he went back to UCH after his analysis, he would ask these eminent doctors, you're telling me that the treatment for this is X. What is the evidence? Most of the time, they couldn't tell him. Anyway, he was taken prisoner of war during World War II, Archie Cochrane, and medical students and doctors, when taken prisoner of war, were often put to work looking after sick fellow prisoners. And Cochrane recounted this incredibly moving story of a dying Russian who was screaming with pain. And Cochrane had nothing to give him. He had access to nothing, no drugs. And he examined the young man, found he had severe pleurisy and pneumonia, couldn't do anything about it. But what he did do was he simply took this dying man in his arms and hugged him. And this eventually caused the man to stop screaming, and he died peacefully in his arms. And I told this story to tie in with Trotter's observation that the most important thing that a doctor brings to the clinical encounter with a patient is not this treatment or that science or that drug or that operation or that test, but your interest. Your interest in the patient is more important than anything, any treatment, being interested. And I thought, this is it. This is the holy grail. This is the simple truth of medicine. Bring your interest. Even if there's nothing you can do to alter the course of the disease, your interest, your compassion can still heal. As Cochrane's compassion helped that soldier to die a peaceful death. He wasn't alone. He wasn't screaming.
Mm.
So
incredible.
This is a central theme of the book.
Yes.
And Trotter, for all his achievements as in surgery, technical achievements, for all his garlanded science experiments, despite this, he said, no, forget all of that. It's your interest is the key thing.
Would you say care? Would you substitute the word interest for care?
No, I think interest is a great word. You're
okay.
interested. I think you're interested. I think it's such a great word. I think care is overused.
Okay.
But no, I think interest. I like the word. It's the word he used, and I think it speaks to me as a doctor.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's about engagement, isn't it? I suppose care is an inherent part of interest, isn't it? So there is a degree of interchangeability. I'm thinking back to Freud as well. I'm thinking, like you say, about because Cochrane's experience very much chimes with, or it seems to chime with Trotter's approach, which is one of care. He's not bothered about the celebrity. He's not bothered about being seen by the paparazzi outside Buckingham Palace and having a big announcement made. And there wasn't Sky News or BBC News rolling 24/7 then anyway. But you can imagine that sort of attention being anathema to Trotter, and Trotter being more interested in there's a sick man, like you say, no to little regard of status or prestige, but there's a sick man who's been sick for 6 months or whatever. We haven't got to the bottom of this. I need to go and help him. He's suffering. Whereas with Freud, the way I read it in the book, going back to that contrast, Freud seemed to be interested in people almost as things, as a curiosity. So his interest, if you want to call it, so yes, he was interested, but he was interested for his intellectual stimulation rather than in terms of the outcome for the individual. Is that a fair summary?
That is absolutely fair. And Freud admitted that. He was indifferent to the outcome. And he freely admitted that his interest in the patients was, as you say, only as raw material for his written work. He didn't actually care whether they got better or not. And I contrasted Freud's involvement with Princess Alice with Trotter's cure of George V. So, Freud famously advised in the case of Princess Alice of Greece, who was Prince Philip's mother, who experienced a psychotic breakdown in the 1920s, late 1920s. Now, he never saw her, but gave detailed advice to Ernst Simmel, who was the psychiatrist in charge of the clinic in Berlin where she was taken. But he gave this bizarre advice that they should induce a premature menopause by irradiating her ovaries, which only made her worse, actually. But Freud was indifferent. He was actually indifferent to whether they got better or not. And he often fibbed about outcome in patients. So famously, one of the few cases that he wrote up in great detail was the case of the rat man. And in fact, the 5-hour lecture that he gave in Salzburg was about the rat man. So the rat man was a young Viennese Jewish lawyer who had rat-related obsessive thoughts. Now, Freud gave the impression in the 5-hour lecture that the rat man was effectively cured, which was not the case at all. Freud wasn't bothered. In fact, he would sometimes see people for years or even decades, most famously the Wolfman. So his interest was at a distance. His interest was looking at human beings, almost like he looked at the laboratory animals that he dissected back in the University of Vienna. He wasn't bothered about them as humans, as fellow humans, I think, in the way that Trotter was. And Trotter famously said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that every intervention, every treatment, its only importance is whether it contributes to the recovery of the patient. It's of no importance otherwise. So the recovery of the patient was at the core of his medicine. That was the central core of his medicine, which was not important to Freud.
Is there some degree of moral hazard with that then, in the sense that some of these psychoanalysts were basically prescribing things or telling people do this or don't do that or whatever, and then it was like, well, whatever, if you get better, you get better. If you don't, no worries. And they were kind of hacking. There was a lot of hacking around, wasn't there, with different things? And
well, there was two problems. First of all, in the 1920s, there was the development of what's called lay analysis. So Freud's original circle were pretty much all doctors. Now, the advantage there is that you had some idea of the duties involved in the therapeutic relationship. Okay, you were trained in that almost subconsciously. I suppose the second advantage was that you could spot if there was something else going on, or if you were out of your depth, or so on. You had some background in managing a professional encounter between therapist and patient. And then in the 1920s, partly because he wanted to endorse his own daughter Anna's career, Freud pushed and in fact was very encouraging of the idea of lay analysts. Sorry, there was one exception, Otto Rank. Reich, Theodor Reich. there was the development of lay analysis. And I think a lot of lay analysts who included very famous figures like Melanie Klein, Anna Freud, Joan Riviere, James Strachey, Princess Marie Bonaparte, I think were practicing way beyond their competence.
Mm.
And because they had not been to medical school, they had no concept of scientific method, about the limits and duties of the therapeutic encounter. Now, the second strand here is that Freud and psychoanalysts in general were very careful to pick their patients. They wouldn't take on anybody with a serious psychiatric illness, such as psychosis or profound melancholia. They would deal only with neurosis, hysteria, which was a disappearing disease anyway. And a lot of the time, they were delighted to take on people who had no psychological problem, but were simply curious and narcissistic and wanted to explore their own fabulous, brilliant minds. And that was fine. They didn't do any harm. But the minute they wandered off that kind of narrow remit, they certainly caused a lot of harm. Melanie Klein famously analyzed her own children and caused a lot of harm to them. Anna Freud caused even more harm to the two children she analyzed belonging to Dorothy Burlingham. So Anna Freud's life partner was an American woman called Dorothy Burlingham, who fled a bad marriage and arrived in Vienna in the 1920s to be analyzed by Sigmund Freud, ended up becoming Anna Freud's life partner, moved into an apartment in the same building as the Freuds with her children, and subjected her two eldest children, Bob and Maddie, to prolonged, decades-long analysis with Anna Freud. This analysis caused them major problems as adults. One died of alcoholism, essentially, and one died of an overdose. Famously took the overdose in Anna Freud's house in Hampstead in London, which is now the Freud Museum. So it's not true to say that, oh, well, maybe it didn't work, but it was harmless. It actually did cause quite a bit of harm, particularly to children. The lay analysts became very influential later on. And in fact, this huge internecine war that took place within British psychoanalysis was between the respective followers of Anna Freud and Melanie Klein, both of whom were entirely uncredentialed. And yet they became these, highly influential people within child analysis and child psychiatry. So I guess one of the themes of the book also is about the nature of expertise within psychology, psychiatry, and medicine more broadly. And I would lay a lot of the blame on this at Freud's door. He encouraged the development of lay analysis. Ernest Jones, to give him his due, always told people who came to him asking for advice on how to become an analyst, he always advised them, go to medical school first, become a doctor, qualify in medicine, and then undergo formal training in psychoanalysis. And he very much adhered to the medical professional model. But I think there were a lot of dangers in the lay analysis model, particularly as the stories of Anna Freud and Melanie Klein show.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so some of the side, well, you couldn't even call them side effects, much more than side effects, but some of the impacts, some of the direct impacts and consequences of that lay analysis, it makes for pretty sobering reading. So as we kind of wrap this up, Seamus, you being a former practitioner yourself in the medical field, having written the books that you've written, what would you say to people in choosing a medical practitioner, somebody, whether it's a therapist, whether it's somebody in the more general medical field, what advice would you give them in terms of what to look for in their practitioner, given what you've said about the likes of Trotter?
Well, the first remark I would make in regard to that is that nowadays, in countries where medicine is state provided, you very often don't have a choice um, uh, as to your medical attendant, be that primary care doctor or hospital specialist. I'm slightly wary, slightly suspicious of the notion of choosing a doctor like you might choose a hairdresser. But given those provisos, I would say listen to going back to what Trotter said, the interest of the doctor trumps everything. Is the doctor interested in you and your problem? And if the answer to that is yes, then, you're with the right doctor. Now, the health system, the medical regulators like the GMC and the medical schools should, as far as possible, prevent incompetent people from practicing medicine. Now, they don't always achieve that, but they should minimize incompetence. They will never entirely eradicate it. But I think you have to go in with some degree of good faith that your doctor is going to be technically competent. And after that, I would say interest is everything.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Seamus. It's been a really enlightening conversation to me as well. I've read the book from cover to cover. I found it absolutely fascinating the first time. I really enjoyed going back through it prior to this conversation. I've enjoyed this conversation. There's so much to be taken away from it. Like you say, the number of characters that you've included in the book is vast. Everybody has a contribution to make. There's a story to tell, or there's a lesson to derive from each individual. So I highly recommend people pick it up. Again, I will remind people what it is called. It's The Guru, the Bagman and the Sceptic, a story of science, sex and psychoanalysis by Seamus O'Mahony. Seamus, thank you so much for your time on the Real Clear Values podcast.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, Tom.